Hey folks, wanted to give you a quick video here going over the announcements for Unit 3. I want to start off with going over some stuff from last week. So there were a few questions where some people had some trouble on the quiz, and so I want to take a look at those here. This sheet here, we've got kind of, I guess, three of the quiz questions that we're going to go over. And I'll kind of explain why correct answers are correct, why you might have missed points. So this one here, habat hahi. Okay, so this one you'll notice the article is located on both the noun bat, which is daughter, and hahi. Now this here, he, this can be the female pronoun. It can mean she, but it can also be the far demonstrative for a singular feminine noun. And so that's the case here because this would, a couple reasons why. One, in this context, you don't have any reason to think that the pronoun is functioning independently. There's no verb or anything like that. Furthermore, it has the article. So anytime you see a pronoun like he with the article, you can be pretty sure that it's functioning as the demonstrative. In this case, attributively functioning as the demonstrative because it comes after the noun and it agrees indefiniteness. So that's how we know this is attributive. If it's attributive, the far demonstrative is going to be that. So here we've got that girl, or I shouldn't say girl, we've got that daughter here. So bat is daughter, hahi, that one. So that daughter is going to be the appropriate translation. Some of you, if you translate it as that is the daughter, that would be incorrect because that is the daughter would be a predicative translation. And in that case, it would lack the article. You would have habat he or he habat. In those cases, you could have that is the daughter. If you translated the phrase here as this daughter, that would be incorrect because you would have zot here, the pronoun zot, hazot specifically. Hazot is this. Habat hazot would be this daughter. So a lot of different translations here, but in order to get this one correct, it would be that daughter. The next one we're going to look at here is very similar. He habat, and like I said above, here he lacks the article, so there's a disagreement between the demonstrative and the noun. In that case, both because the pronoun precedes the noun and because there's a disagreement with regard to the article, that tells you that this is predicative. And in this situation, we would have the, we call it a copula or just a to be verb, is. We would have that here. So we have here, that is the daughter. All right, and so again, if you put that daughter down here, you're incorrect because that daughter is attributive, and we would expect to have the article on he, ha-he. If you put this is the daughter, again, that would be zot habat. All right, so hopefully that explains why you missed any points on this one. If you still have questions, please let me know. And then finally, we'll look at this translation here. We have Shalach hamelech et hana'ar esher yeshav, and there is a typo here, but it shouldn't cause you much confusion. Both of these baits should have a dagesh. So yashav babait is what this should read as. But again, that shouldn't cause you too much of a problem here. So if I'm just walking through this translation one word at a time, again, Hebrew, when you translate Hebrew into English, there are two stages that you need to walk through. The first one, stage one, is to analyze each Hebrew word individually. Try to figure out as much information about each one as you can. Again, as you practice this and you develop your intuition and you develop these habits, you won't have to spend as much time on each word. You can probably just gloss through the sentence pretty easily. But remember that stage one is to analyze the Hebrew word by word. Stage two then is to build the sentence or the phrase in English. You can't forget to do both of those. So stage one, let's look at shalach. Shalach, this is the lexical form. So we know this. This is the Cal Perfect 3MS form that means he sent. This tells me that my subject should be a masculine singular noun, or it's just he if there is no noun in the Hebrew. Again, in Hebrew, you're generally going to see that the very first word of a clause is going to be the main verb. Sometimes you'll have maybe a temporal phrase before that, but oftentimes your main clause is going to start with the main verb. And then in that second slot, the second location in the sentence, you're often going to have your subject if you have an explicit subject. Now, generally speaking, you're usually only going to have an explicit subject for third-person verbs anyways, but here we have a third masculine singular verb, so our noun, our subject noun, should be masculine singular as well. And so that very first word after the verb is where we expect to find that subject. Won't always be there, but that's the normal word order usually. And sure enough, we see a masculine singular noun here, hamelech. Hamelech, this is melech. means king. It's got the definite article on it. And so we have the king here. The king sent. Now, again, we don't need to be translating it yet. We don't need to be building it in English. We can just put our gloss here, the king. Note that it's masculine singular. And this is probably the subject of the verb. Moving on, the next thing we see is et. There are two ets in Hebrew. Well, at least, there are two ets that you will learn about. There is the definite direct object marker et, and then there is a preposition et. And ultimately, it's going to come down to context, which makes more sense. But especially when I see et and then I see a definite article after the makef here, I'm thinking definite direct object marker. So this already tells me that the noun following is going to be my direct object. What is that noun? I have ha, na'ar. Here, the he, patak dagesh, tells me that I've got a definite article. Na'ar means, it can mean boy, it can mean servant. So this is the servant. The servant is who is being sent. All right, so we already know this is the definite direct object. So just keep in mind here that this masculine singular noun is your direct object. That will come in handy when we build the sentence in English. Then we've got assure. Assure here, this again is our relative pronoun in Hebrew. It can be translated a lot of different ways in English, so I usually just default to glossing assure with which, and then I can change which as I need to, as context dictates later on. But here I'm just going to put which, and note that this is introducing a relative clause. So in that relative clause, the first word that I get is the verb, yashav. Yashav, again, this is lexical form, Cal Perfect 3 MS. Yashav means he lived, he dwelt. It can mean he sat. It can mean a lot of different things, but often I usually just gloss this as dwell. Okay, so he dwelt is the gloss here. Again, that's not necessarily our translation. And then we have bait preposition, but I've got a patach dagesh. So that tells me that the definite article is hidden there under that bait. Bait can mean in, at, with. It can mean a lot of different things. So I'll just kind of keep all of those glosses available to me, and I'll figure out how to translate it based on the context when I'm done. So in, at, with, what? Again, definite article, the, and then I've got bite. Bite here is the word for house. It's the form that I recognize from my vocabulary. No troubles here. I have now analyzed each of these words. Before you jump into building the sentence in English, you do want to think through the function of each of these words. So shalach, this is most likely my main verb. Hamelech is the subject of that main verb, and hana'ar is the direct object of that main verb. Then I've got a relative pronoun introducing a relative clause. The verb within that relative clause is dwelt, and then this is modifying that verb. Dwelt where? Well, here, since we've got a location of dwelling, this is probably going to be translated in. So we've got in the house. Now, a lot of you translated by it as temple. I'm okay with that. I didn't count you off for that if you translated it as temple. But remember, by it really does mean house. The only time we're going to usually translate it as temple is when it is the house of a god. So if this is the house of Yahweh or the house of Baal in some context, whatever that might be, in that case it refers to a temple, but the word means house. And the only reason why we translate it as temple is because the house of Yahweh refers to the temple of Yahweh. The temple is called the house of Yahweh. All right, so now that we've looked at the function of all the words, we've analyzed all the words and their functions, now we can build this sentence in English. And of course, English, we ask English, how do you build a sentence? What do you start with? And it says, give me the subject first. So I come back to my Hebrew sentence and I ask myself, what is the subject here? And the subject, of course, is the king. So I start my translation as the king. All right, English, we've got the subject. What do you want after the subject? English says, give me the main verb. Okay, well, that was shalach. Shalach meant not he sent. Shalach means sent, okay? And so we're going to put sent here. If you put the gloss he sent in here, you're going to say something like the king he sent, where you've almost created a relative clause. It's almost like you're saying the king whom he sent, but there is no relative pronoun there. That's why you got to be very careful with your pronouns. When you're glossing these verbs, you're only going to use that English pronoun, that English subject pronoun, if you don't have an explicit subject in Hebrew. So here we have the king is our subject, sent is what the king did, that is our verb. English, what do you want after the verb? English says, give me the direct object. Okay, so now we go back to our Hebrew sentence and we say, where's our direct object here? Our definite direct object marker tells us that hana'ar is the subject. Hana'ar means the boy or the servant. Let's keep it a little ambiguous, the servant. I guess the more ambiguous one would be boy. Anyways, you can use either one. The king sent the servant. All right, English, you've got your subject, you got your verb, you got your direct object. What else do you want after that? If you've got an indirect object, give me that, English says. Well, there is no indirect object here. And then basically English says, okay, well, give me whatever else you have. So at this point, now that we've got the subject, the verb, and the object figured out, now we can usually go in whatever order the Hebrew is. It's only really that subject, verb, object situation where English builds the sentence in a different order than Hebrew does. So again, what we have untranslated, we've dealt with shalach, we've dealt with hamelech, we've dealt with et hana'ar. Now we have esher yeshav babayit. All right, so next is asher. What does asher mean? Well, again, we said which, but that's a gloss. We need to kind of look at the sentence in context to find out if that's the best way to translate it. So next we have dwelt, and we might even say in parentheses, he dwelt. And then we have the rest is babayit, and so this is going to be in the house. All right, so now as we read through this, the king sent the servant which dwelt in the house. We don't need the he pronoun because which, or asher, is actually going to be the subject. Asher is the subject of this verb. And again, because it's a person who asher is stepping in for, that this is a personal pronoun, personal noun, it's referring to a person who dwelt, we might change which, and again, there's a lot going on here. Asher is the subject of this verb. That means that we're going to use a subject pronoun, and of course in English the subject pronoun is going to be who, or you could say that. Since we have that relative pronoun, we don't need the subject pronoun here. So you could either put this as the king sent the servant who dwelt in the house, or you could say the king sent the servant that dwelt in the house. There is a difference in English between those two sentences, but the context you have here doesn't tell you which one is correct. Either one could be correct. All right, so now let's talk about this week, what we've got ahead of us here. We're jumping into lesson 19, and here we're going to look at the possessive pronouns. We've already looked at some possessive pronouns. I shouldn't say possessive pronouns, possessive pronoun suffixes. We're going to look at possessive pronoun suffixes. We've already looked at some that go on singular nouns. Now, unfortunately, the bad news is that when you put these suffixes on plural nouns, they look different. That's the bad news. The good news is they don't look that different. They look pretty similar, and so we'll look at that here. So it's very important to remember that just because you have a singular or plural noun or a singular or plural suffix, those two do not influence each other. The noun can be singular or plural, and the suffix at the same time can be singular or plural. I hope I haven't made that more confusing. Just remember that the number of the suffix and the number of the noun are independent of each other. All right, so looking at this, I also want to point out to you the similarities. You know, the suffixes are different when they go on singular nouns versus plural nouns, but they're not that different. So for example, 3ms, whether it's singular or plural, the 3ms suffix is going to have a vav. Here it's a holem vav, here it's a kametz yod vav, but it's a vav. 3fs, you're going to have a kametz and a hey. So for the singular form, it's a kametz hey with the mapik. For the plural form of the noun, it's a segel yod hey with a kametz, so it's different order, but there's still a kametz and there's still a hey. Second masculine singular, you're going to have the kaf kametz. In the plural form of the noun, it's going to have the segel yod, but it's still kaf kametz. Same for 2fs, kaf shava. Again, the first part of the suffix is going to be a little bit different. And then 1cs, you're going to have a yod, no matter whether the noun is singular or plural. You're going to have a mem in the third masculine plural, so it's either or hem, on or hen, and the 2MP and 2FP forms are actually identical from the kaf forward, kem, ken, echem, echen, and then finally the 1CP is similar, so enu versus enu, it's the same there. So these are very similar. What you should notice, though, is that if the noun is plural, there will always be a yod before the suffix. All right. Now, we do have a yod in the 1CS form. The E suffix is a yod. And the way you tell whether it is my horse or my horses is my horse is hirik yod, my horses is patach yod. But that's the only situation usually where you see a yod and the noun is singular. If the noun is plural, it will always have a yod in that suffix, so be aware of that also. All right, so that is the possessive suffixes on plural nouns. Let's look now at the Hebrew verb YaKoL. And the reason why they throw this in here at this point is because this is just sort of a weird, it doesn't quite fit in with what most of the one yods do. So it's better to kind of look at it on its own. And the reason why YaKoL is unusual is because not only is it a one yod, but it's also a stative verb. Remember, stative verbs are verbs that communicate not actions, but they predicate states about their subjects. So we usually have a to be verb in the translation here. So YaKoL means not to do something, but to be some way. YaKoL means he is able or he was able. It's okay because of the ways stative verbs work. You can really translate them either as present or as past. The perfect conjugation is a little bit more flexible with stative verbs. Probably best at this point for you to just keep translating perfect verbs as past tense and imperfect verbs as future tense. But again, there's some flexibility here with stative verbs. So YaKoL is he was able. And this is also important to realize the conjugation is pretty similar. The main difference from the perfect that you'll see with YaKoL is that the theme vowel, sometimes we call it a theme vowel, sometimes we call it R2 vowel for the second root letter. Whatever you refer to it as, this is the vowel on the second root letter is very important. So sometimes we'll call it the theme vowel, sometimes we'll call it the stem vowel, sometimes we'll call it the R2 vowel, whatever. But this vowel does not do what you usually expect a perfect conjugation to do. This one is holum rather than patach. But on the imperfect, where you usually expect a holum in R2, you actually get patach. So this is a strange verb in that it's kind of flipped there. A lot of stative verbs in the perfect will have a holum. Some have a sere instead, like kaved, but a lot of them do have a holum. And then there are some stative verbs in the perfect that just have a patach like normal, but they happen to be stative. So that's the thing to be aware of here, is that the O-class stative verbs, usually they will retain that O-class vowel throughout the conjugation. With kaved, we saw it in the third person, but when you go to the second person, first person, kaved, the conjugation goes back to patach there instead of the sere. For the O-class, that O-class theme vowel will usually stay throughout the conjugation. Now, you're not going to get it when you have to reduce the R2 vowel to a shavah, but if you'll notice here in the second person plural, we've got what looks like a kametz. This is not a kametz, this is a kametz chatuf. And the reason why you know it's a kametz chatuf is because the accent, the tonic, is the final syllable, which means that this is now a closed, unaccented syllable. And anytime you see this symbol in a closed, unaccented syllable, you know that this is a kametz chatuf. So this is YaKoLtem. Not YaKoLtem, YaKoLtem, YaKoLten. And then here we have YaKoLnu. All right. So that's the uniqueness of YaKoL in the perfect. When we go to the imperfect, not only do we get the unexpected theme vowel, and again, for a lot of stative verbs, you end up with a patach in your R2 vowel in the imperfect. So that's not crazy unusual, but it isn't what we learned with KTOL, for example, YaKoL. The other thing that is particularly unusual about YaKoL is that it is one of the one yod vavs as opposed to a true one yod. But in this particular case, what happens is you can see that it's a one yod vav because when you conjugate it in the imperfect, that vav, that one vav comes back. Now it comes back in the form of a shurik, and so you can either think of this as the one yod vav, the first root letter reverts back to the vav. You can think of it that way. Or you can think of it as that first root letter just drops out altogether and you get a very unusual prefix vowel. In this case, shurik would be your prefix vowel. Whatever's easier, however it's easier for you to remember this, just understand that the reason why this looks so unusual is because YaKoL is a very particular category of one yod vav where it actually reverts to the vav and becomes a shurik. You know, that's why it looks so unusual, but that's what's going on here. So hopefully that makes sense. If you have any questions, again, ask, but that's why we're looking at YaKoL just kind of on its own because it's so unusual. Well, that's pretty much it for lesson 19. Remember that you can always check over here on modules. We will pull up right above Unit 1, we've got important course information, this Hebrew vocabulary spreadsheet. Again, you don't have to use this. This is just an option for you. If you go down here to lesson 19, here we go, we've got our vocabulary. So first one, key. I don't have a great memory aid here. It's difficult to do memory aids for conjunctions. So I think what I've got here is just some information about key. I apologize, that's hard to scroll sideways. So key has two very common functions and several other less common functions. The primary function for key is that it introduces the cause for the main verb. This is what we call a causal conjunction because it introduces a causal clause. When this happens, we usually translate key as for such and such or because such and such. The second very common function of key is that it introduces a content phrase or a content clause. And when that happens, we translate it as that, or we may even leave it untranslated. So here's some examples. Genesis 3:5 contains key, and it contains key twice. And each of them has a different function. Let me pull that up real quick so we can look at it here. So here we've got Genesis 3:5. It begins with key. This is the causal key. This is giving a reason or an explanation or the cause of verse 4. Verse 4 says, and the serpent said to the woman, Lo mot, you will not die. Ta mutun. This is a very unusual form, but this basically is the phrase, you surely shall not die. You surely won't die. So this is, the serpent said to the woman, you shall not surely die. And then verse 5 is going to explain why the serpent is saying this. Why did the serpent say to the woman, you surely shall not die? Because God knows, and actually this is probably still the speech of the serpent. So here it's not explaining why the serpent said this. It's explaining why you shall not die. You shall not die. Why not? Why shan't we die? Because God is knowing that. So again, key, but a different function. What is God knowing? God is knowing that in the day of your eating from the tree, your eyes will be open, such and such. So here's a great example of the same conjunction used in two different ways. It has two different functions here. And so you would translate it two different ways in English. But again, you can go through this spreadsheet and see other stuff. You'll see that a lot of these conjunctions, I really don't have much for at all. So I try to give you some verses where you see the function come up. Hopefully that will help you remember what it means. So again, don't forget that columns, I think it's column, I can't remember if it's column E or column F, but beginning with one of these two, you can actually edit the spreadsheet and you can add your own memory aids if you have them. So feel free to do that. All right, don't forget that your peer reviews are due by 11:59 p.m. Central Time on Wednesday. If you do not have those done on time, I will go through and you will get a 50% penalty for your previous week's Futato exercises. It's very important for you to do those peer reviews. All right, so your final assignment for this week is going to be to select your local mentor. Now, I'll say this, don't wait until the end of the week to do this because you actually need to send them something before this is complete. So if you click here, this is going to open up your part of the Unit 3 component. For some reason, this link isn't working for some people. What you need to do is you need to first choose your mentor, and once you know who that is, don't use this link to send to them. Go ahead and fill this stuff out yourself. But the actual link that you want to send your mentor, a better place to get this is to come over here into modules and then to go to local mentor qualifications under the local mentor assignment. And for some reason, this is the link that you want to send them. Now, you can either, a couple things you can do here. You can either right click and say copy link and then go paste it in an email, or you can go ahead and just click this link and it will bring up this form here and you can come up to your, address bar, Control-C, Command-C, whatever you use, and that will copy and then paste it into the email. But your local mentor needs to access this form, and they will fill this out. They'll basically read through what this assignment is, what their requirements are, and then they will fill out their first name, their last name, their phone number, their email, and then they will select which experience criteria they fulfill, and then they will fill out your information down here. Please give them your course number and your course name. They can't submit this without that information. So give them your name, first and last, the course number, which again, that's going to be up here, BS2201. That should be enough. And then the course name, which is Elementary Hebrew 2, Spring 2023. Please give them that information because they will need to fill this out. And they may not have the information about the course. So if you have any questions about that, let me know, but hopefully that's relatively straightforward. All right, well, that's going to be it for this week. Again, obviously, let me know if you have any questions. Hope you're doing well. Hope your semester's off to a good start. Take care.